Okay, so I figured I see a couple people here, so why don't we get started, Joe?
Sure thing.
Um, for anyone new to the AMA, my name is Danae, and I'm the communication manager here in the Greene Center. And this is our executive director, Joe Testani. Hi, Joe.
Hi. Hi, Danae.
Hi. We've been doing this for a few weeks now, and it's been a lot of fun. We've had a lot of really great questions, a lot of great advice, and I'm hoping we can continue that conversation today. So essentially, the whole premise of the AMAs is to really dig into some things that are going on due to COVID-19 and how that's impacting all things career related, essentially. So to get started, Joe, I was hoping you could maybe update us a little bit on any recent industry trends that you're seeing. I know we've talked a bit before about some industries that are really hiring right now, like Instacart and delivery services. But then we've also seen recently that like retail is kind of hurting throughout all this. And I'd love if you could just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think some of the trends we had talked about in previous sessions about who's hiring is still pretty accurate in terms of the tech sector, healthcare, some nonprofits, especially any organizations that are trying to provide relief to people with COVID or that are affected by COVID. So I think those are still sort of tracking our Handshake partner, and you can probably drop that in the link today in the chat today about the more recent hiring that the press release they sent out about who's still hiring and which jobs are active. So I think those are still pretty holding true. I think what we're starting to see, I think, is the long-term implications of closures, like in-person closures. So retail is the obvious one in terms of its impact on a brick and mortar retail, but also retail in terms of people, if they're laid off or if they're impacted jobs, they're not probably shopping and buying things that are not high need or high necessity. So, retail, J. Crew being one of the first ones, but there's probably going to be another sort of swell of other organizations that are probably either declaring bankruptcy or declaring some sort of financial turmoil. The first ones to go when this all started was tourism and anything related to travel. The airline industries, a lot of the tourism areas like the Royal Caribbean and things like that, plus places that were destinations or reliant on tourism, like Disney World and things like that. But what's happening now, I think, is really interesting, is that as some of those entities are maybe going down or failing or starting to declare bankruptcy or alarms are going off in terms of revenue, there's other organizations that are trying to pivot and figure out, like, all right, how do we rebrand? I think you and I were talking about Airbnb this week, or I was talking to somebody about that, how Airbnb is trying to sort of take their model of, obviously, rental properties and starting to think about how do we continue to use the platform to expose people to different parts of the world, different parts of the country, maybe experiences they've never had in a virtual kind of environment. So I think companies are starting to be creative to think about what else can we be doing that's going to be on brand? What else can generate revenue that might be helpful and supportive to keep the company afloat? Even higher ed is trying to figure this out to some degree, at least some institutions are, in thinking about if revenue streams shift or change in the future, what are the alternative revenue streams that higher ed can look at that will help them sustain their businesses moving forward. So I think we're starting to be in this flux state. I think it's going to vary widely over the next few months, depending on where you live in the country. California is still going to be pretty stringent. They're going to roll out slowly in terms of opening. Georgia, already rolled out some opening measures. New York's going to be a little slower in different parts of the state. And then different parts of the world, you're seeing, I think, a variety of openings and impact and reoccurrences of COVID. So I feel like it's can be so geographically specific in some ways that then might impact some of these larger brands that have locations all over the country, restaurant chains, retail, things like that. So those are some of the things I think that I feel like are starting to see, and obviously a lot of this is dominated by what people report out on, and I think some of it's based on earnings. So tomorrow we'll have unemployment numbers. There's earnings reports for different companies that are going to be released for the next few days. Some of them are retail. So we're going to start to see a lot more of these quarter 1 earnings and issues and impact that over the next few weeks.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, it's all very interesting and it's
Yeah.
so dependent on the industry, right? Like what you were saying. And while you were talking, it reminded me of a conversation we had yesterday about how for people in the job force right now who are trying to find a job and maybe they've always thought that they're going to work in this specific industry, but due to all of this, there's not as many opportunities anymore
Yeah.
in that said industry. Even what you said about like retail, like for example, J. Crew, like you said, is filing for bankruptcy, right? So let's say someone with tech skills isn't going to their dream company anymore, but think about even bankruptcy lawyers who have a need for now more online support and tech
Yep.
support. And so it's all about being able to pivot and just kind of flip the switch a little bit on how you're looking at things as you graduate and as you're looking for opportunities.
And I think to that end, Danae, I think the key thing here is as companies maybe evolve or change how they do business, that might
Mhm.
require them to hire different kinds of workforces.
Sure.
So let's say J. Crew decides to close all their brick and mortar, but maintain an online brand presence. That changes the whole dynamic. Now they've obviously been offering, online, clothing and shopping for a while now. But if they moved solely to that model, what does that mean for marketing communications? What does that mean
Mhm.
for their supply chain? What does that mean for their online support and the development of any sort of retail that looks like online to sort of distinguish them from other places? So it's really interesting with these brands that actually have some cachet, what they might do and how they might adapt to this, and then what does that mean for their workforce that they want? And does that also mean that they can hire people more broadly all over the world, as opposed to being relegated to certain geographic areas, since that might be less relevant in the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I do see a question coming in. So there seems to be new opportunities with the Department of Health as contact tracers or
Mhm.
Govern America with government projects on how to address COVID. Do you think these are good opportunities to look into if I'm a recent graduate?
Yeah, I saw some of those come through our office this week and last week, and I think they're interesting. I think if that's something that you have an interest in, I think they're really relevant for whether it's a summer or a full-time opportunity. If it's something that you think you want to give back to and feel that you can help make a difference, I think that's kind of part of the equation, especially for organizations that are trying to help solve some of the issues that the pandemic has created. So for the contact tracing, for Govern America, these are about advocacy, getting information out there, about supporting some of our communities. And if that's something that you've already been inclined to be involved in while you were in college, sure, I think those are going to be really great options for you to pursue or look at as real possibilities for summer or post grad, maybe even temporarily post grad, in while searching for more stable or full time opportunities. But I think there's going to be a need for that. And I think that's probably going to increase. I think you see what's happened with food banks and their need for volunteers and need for fundraising to get more food to people. That's going to continue to be a challenge if this goes on and if there's a reoccurrence of that. So I think there's some effort that we have to pay attention to in terms of like what are those social needs or community needs that might be something that we can look to. But I think there are great opportunities right now, and there might be other opportunities like that in government or community-based organizations.
That's so true. You're right. So I do see another question. So you have talked a little bit about all these different industries that are being affected, right? So do you mind maybe just sharing a bit more about some specific skill sets that students should be focusing on during this time that will help them be a bit more marketable in these changing markets?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is um, just an ability to adapt and read and react, right? I think that's going to be something that is going to be the norm. I think was already happening and becoming the norm before. Something that we've talked about in our office and something that I've written about, in the past around the future of work. So I think that's going to be very much how can students articulate their ability to adapt to situations, adapt to different scenarios, help an organization adapt to different scenarios. I think that's going to be key. On our website, we talk about our college competencies at the University of Rochester, which are very much in line with other campuses or other national sort of ideas around success skills, or formally, well, at least I formally call them soft skills. But I think those are even more critical now. So ability to communicate effectively, both verbally and in written form, but also now virtually. How do you do that effectively? The ability to really get into and identify and solve problems is going to be really, really important, because I think they'll continue to pop up with this. If there's recurrence of this, companies or organizations are going to face kind of a growing list of issues or problems. How do we respond to them? How do companies respond to them? So someone's ability to articulate experiences they've had in the past where they've helped a student organization, a company, a faculty member, whatever it is, do that effectively, I think it's going to be really key. I think so if you look at the college competencies that we have, a lot of those are going to be very much still very relevant and important to highlight, on top of any sort of technical or specialized skill that you might have in sort of your discipline or area of study or just experience that you've had in the past. I think those are definitely some key things that students and anyone really, if they're in the job market already, or if they've been out a few years and are transitioning, how do you convey those things? I think if we kind of fast forward it into the sort of a third bucket into what future work skills are critical, it's dealing with wide sets of knowledge or data. How do you decipher information out of that? That's only going to continue to grow in terms of the amount of information or data that we have access to. How do you navigate that? How do you understand that? And then translate that for an end user to some degree. And I think even more so in that space, what's the end user's experience going to be now that we have so many things online or happening virtually right now? It was there before, but now so many people are engaging in courses online for the first time, or experiencing meetings for the first time in person. I think we take it for granted sometimes in the higher ed environment that this is something maybe a lot of people are used to, but in many industry sectors, for many people, this might be a new experience on so many levels. But people's ability to translate and react in those environments and be able to really think through what that user experience is, I think it's going to be a really interesting space in the future.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So when you're talking about students being able to adapt right to the situation, I'm curious if you think that we'll see more and more students start gravitating towards entrepreneurship.
That's a good one. I think, at U of R, we've already had, I think, a growing interest in the space of entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship, meaning that you're working maybe within an organization that allows you to have a lot of freedom, or so you're not part of like a founder or anything like that, but you're part of an organization that is very much a startup mode. I think we've already been gravitating towards that way. I think that kind of coincides with the efforts around, or the trends around, the gig economy. And I think what we've been seeing over the last few years is more and more people are wanting control over what they work on, who they work with, and when they work on it. And I think this kind of falls into that category to a degree. And if it becomes easier for people to start businesses and to get startup funds, whether that's through business competitions or startup funds from university or anything else like that, I think it'll allow more people to take that risk and jump into it, or if they have a safety net in their families, it might encourage more people to take that risk and jump into it. So I think it will only spur it on more, because I think the key thing that entrepreneurship provides is a level of excitement and control, but also a certain level of risk. And if you're more inclined towards a risky kind of those propositions, this is the time to jump into those kinds of opportunities, because it may just present itself as an option. But as technology continues to evolve, as we become more close, I guess if you could say, like, so we were globalized, but yet we're kind of able to connect with each other more intimate way around the world. I think entrepreneurship allows us to then see problems, solve problems, scale solutions to problems. And I think we'll see more and more of that. I think we're seeing that from our students on a regular basis, and their ability to start companies or nonprofits that are solving problems they see in their communities, but then realizing that those same problems might exist in other parts of the world. And I think this COVID experience is only enlightening that even more so, the problems we have in the United States, but in other places around the world, and what are solutions that we can help sort of maybe create or provide that might address or support people.
Yeah, I do have to say, like, it's been terribly just interesting seeing all of these new things come up
Yeah.
and seeing people tap into their entrepreneurship skills. Like, I can't go, I feel like, a day without checking LinkedIn and seeing someone with some new endeavor that they're doing. And it's just really exciting to see that. Like, even though COVID does feel like such a heavy thing that's disrupted so many different areas of our lives, like, it's really inspiring to see a lot of people take that situation and then run with it.
Well, I think we see that at any given point, if you trace back to any recession or disruptive economic or societal event that's happened, you'll tend to see some sort of innovation come out of that, right? And I think to solve some of these ills or whatever that event sort of shed light on. And I think what you remember, like in 2008, 2009, it was a very different technological environment than it is now, in terms of our ability to connect and access information and resources. Sometimes it's hard to like go back and remember, like, wait, what was it like in 08 and 09? Yes, we had the internet, and yes, there was a lot of things happening. And Facebook was what, 4 years old or 5 years old at the time. So there's so many things that have shifted and changed, which then allow for maybe more innovation spaces, especially if it's an online or app or something along those lines. So I think there's always that comes out of or is born out of these kinds of environments, because sometimes it just forces that. Other times it exposes problems that then people want to jump in and solve. And in other cases, it might just give them that sort of kick to jump into it and say, you know what, this is a good time to do this because there's a marketplace for this.
That's a good point. So we have a question. I'm graduating and feeling anxious about getting a job. If I get a job offer, but it's not really what I want, should I still take it or wait for a better option that suits my interest more?
I think this is a highly individual sort of decision. And I think how I'll answer it is more about what are the factors you should weigh in sort of evaluating it, versus telling you should like definitely take the job, like take everything, take what the first thing that comes your way. I think each student and each person is going to be a little different in this space. I think it's important to kind of weigh your financial situation, like how stable is it, how in need might you be to take an opportunity, and does that job fulfill that need, both short term and long term potentially. But what is your situation regarding that, and is that something you need to do? I think secondly, where does it fit into your career trajectory or planning? Is this something that's really far away from where you thought you were going to be? Or is this kind of adjacent to maybe some of the goals that you had and that you were thinking about? One of the tenets that we think about in our office has to do with life design, and something you can research, and there's some great books about it, and we're teaching courses on life design and designing your life in our office. But one of the tenets is to try stuff out. So in many ways, you can look at these opportunities as an option to try something out for 6 months or a year. You're not wed to it for the rest of your career or your life. So if you start to reframe it in that way, it might not seem as daunting to maybe take that job that you maybe didn't want to do. I think the last thing I think to sort of factor into or evaluate for yourself is, what do you think you'll learn? What will you learn from this that you think might be helpful to your career long term? Do you feel like you'll gain some sort of knowledge or skill that you could then parlay or build upon in future opportunities? Because I think that's the name of the game. And like we started at the top of our conversation today about adaptability. Part of adapting is learning and sort of adjusting and sort of taking new information to make decisions in the future or to adapt to new scenarios. So will you learn something and gain some sort of competency or skill that you think then will position you better for whatever and wherever your career might take you in the future. So I think those are definitely some of the factors to think about when evaluating if you should take something in front of you or kind of wait it out for another option that might be better. Because the better thing is kind of very subjective as to what that means. What might be better to me might not be better to you, and so I think it's really kind of weighing all the pieces of that to decide if that's the sort of best route for you to go.
Great. Yeah, I think that's great advice, Joe. Like you said, it's very dependent on the situation, and
Yep.
it's a hard decision right now to make because you don't necessarily want to take a job just to take a job, but in some situations, financially, if you need to take that job,
Yeah.
so it's really tough. Yeah, it's a really tough situation to be in.
I think it depends a little, Danae, on what you bring to the table. How much
Sure.
experience do you have? What kind of things have you done in college? What kinds of activities you've been involved in? What are your prospects? And
Mm-hmm.
if you're not sure what the answer to those questions are, then you could probably be speaking to an advisor, speaking to someone that's a mentor, someone within your network. And if you don't have people in your network, build out your network. And so these are the kinds of questions you'd want to check in with alumni or whoever to kind of gauge whether or not this is something that might fit what your background and profile is. Because sometimes it's hard for you to understand or tell that, but talking to people that work in the industry sector or have some experience might be able to share with you whether or not what your marketability is, so to speak, for different opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So for the students who maybe have secured a job or internship, but recently have found out it's going to be remote going forward,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say they've never really done remote work other than just the last few weeks of classes here at the U of R, do you have any advice for them or tips? Like, I can only imagine how worried they could be with the onboarding process.
Yeah, I think this is something our own team faced the last 2 months,
Yeah.
right? I think most of the staff probably never really worked remote in any significant sort of way, maybe a day here or an afternoon there or something like that. So I think that's something a lot of people are trying to grapple with. So you're not alone if that's kind of the situation you're in. Um, I think in order to prepare to be remote, I you have to do a technology check. First and foremost, do you have the right technology and do you have the right software, computer, internet access, all of these things that allow you to actually do your work as effectively as you're going to be expected to do it. Are you going to be online all day? Are you going to be in Zoom calls all day? Are you just going to be working in databases? Like, it really varies depending on the job, but do you have the right equipment to do the work? I think is a really critical question to ask. And if not, what's it going to take for you to get and ramp up those needs? And that's something possibly to ask an organization as you're getting ready to do a remote virtual internship experience. I think the second thing is be familiarize yourself with all the different tools that are more collaborative in nature or that you could be using. Now, many students have used maybe some form of this or another. So Zoom is obviously an example of that. Slack, Microsoft Teams, project management software, things that are shareable that multiple people can be on at the same time and sharing information, Google Docs, things like that. What's your familiarity and comfort level with those kinds of tools? And if you don't have a lot of familiarity, I think it's a great way to start to ramp up. Some of the companies might already be using certain software, so it might be just familiarizing yourself and asking the question of what kind of collaborative tools that are you using at your organization so that you can download them and get familiar. A lot of these companies like Slack or Microsoft Teams, you have online tutorials you can watch and do self-directed learning and stuff like that. So there's a variety of things I think that software-wise that are important to learn. But I think if the company's already using some, familiarize yourself with that. If they're not, what are things that maybe you can bring into the table that might help you to share your information, but also collaborate really, really well with them. I think the last thing is something we talked about earlier about competencies. How well do you write and how well do you verbalize your ideas? And I think this becomes increasingly important in a virtual environment. It's important usually in an in-person environment, but you're only relegated in many cases to these kinds of interactions. So how well are you articulating? How much time do you need to prepare typically to present something verbally? How well are you writing things? Because then there might be different opportunities to collaborate or workshop ideas together, virtually. So I think those are going to be key things I think to pay attention to, because communication becomes even more relevant and critical when we're remote, because you can't just pop over to someone's cubicle or office and ask a quick question. It's a little different in terms of figuring that out. And so you have to think through that, or unless the people have created environments that allow you to do that, it's sometimes going to be a little bit more labor intensive.
Sure. So, Joe, what has helped you transitioning to remote work?
Good question, Danae. Well, I think I have a high tolerance and comfort level with technology. So like doing stuff online and using different software, it doesn't really bother me or faze me. I feel like I pick up things pretty quickly. And so, you and I have a Slack channel that we use pretty often, been on Zoom all day. I'm a fan of Google Docs. So like my comfort level in the technology front, like really wasn't much of a transition, because I think I'm really, I think just it's something that I really actually enjoy, using different technology to solve and do some of the work. I think the challenge, I like in-person interaction and conversations, and I like to work with people and talk with them, whether that's students as my advisees or people on our team. So that's been hard. And then so I have to think through like my email messages, or when I'm on Zoom, I typically will, when I'm in person, I'll rely a lot on nonverbals. When I'm in Zoom, I kind of like, it's harder to read some nonverbals. You have to kind of really look at the screen and, looking at all the people, which is just harder to do sometimes. That's been a challenge. And I think that's something I'm adapting to, but it also then requires me to be available to people outside of those environments, so people can ask questions, or maybe I have to text them or call them to follow up and see if there's things that maybe weren't addressed, and when I'm talking to a group about something challenging or just in general. So I feel like that's kind of continues to force me to think about my communication and think about how I'm delivering content and information to the team, which is kind of key. But overall, I think the isolation is the biggest problem for me, and not being around people. And that's something that technology doesn't solve, or at least for me. And so that's probably the hardest part.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. Like, technology is awesome and great, but sometimes you just miss those casual side conversations. Whereas I've found that a lot of the collaboration that I'm doing with people in our office, it's through like a scheduled Zoom meeting. So everything's much more formal in that sense, where you don't get like the side combo you might have walking down the hall, like, hey, like, how's your cat doing? Like, that's not really happening as much. So I agree. Like, I kind of miss those moments a lot. And I mean, thank God for technology too, because it has been great even to use Zoom. I know some days we're a little like, Zoom, like I can't handle another meeting, but it is great that we even have that, and we can do things just like this.
You're probably happy, because I used to pop in your office all the time and like some random idea as I was walking by, like drive-by ideas. So I'm sure you're happy. Like it has to be controlled a little bit now, and I have to just dump it in a Slack channel and I can't bother you with it. So I'm sure you're actually like really excited about that.
A little bit more organized. I do have to say, like our team has really stepped up so much, and we've all had to learn how to just communicate. You know what I mean? It's a bit different. Like you were saying, like we've streamlined some things. We've learned how to really communicate and get down to the point. And yeah, when you have ideas, you have a Slack channel of ideas, and you just throw them in there, and the organization has been so helpful.
I'll have to admit, when we go back to the office, I'll still use the Slack channel with you, but I'll probably still come by your office and tell you ideas I have.
Okay. All right. That sounds great.
Fair warning.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem.
So in relation to hopefully in the future being back in the office, we had a question come in about next year's graduating class. Do you envision that they will also be affected by the pandemic if things don't return to normal by the fall? And will recruiting suffer?
This is an interesting one. Some of it depends upon what companies' choices are for this year, for this summer. Those companies, and I'll be frank, those companies that cancel their internships outright are going to have a problem next year, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any evidence to back it up yet, but I think they might have done damage to their brand. They lost out on a talent pool that could be future hires, because they, if they hired interns this summer, they could have converted those people into full-time hires for next summer. And then they would have had like a leg up on their 2021 class already. And some people weren't able to do that, and I get that. But I think it's going to be, I think those companies might feel really a lot of the pinch and the pain on that. Those companies that were able to convert and move to virtual and do like that, they're sitting in good shape, right? Because those students some of them have committed already to next year and postgraduate plans. And so their fall recruiting might be looking to fill gaps that they have versus doing a full-blown hiring of like a whole class of graduates. I think the virtual engagement is going in the fall for employers is going to favor the ones that have been doing it longer, are more comfortable with it, and have a little bit stronger brand identity with the campus. Those that need to establish that, I think they're gonna have to get creative, and that's where I think our team can step in and help companies do that. But that's gonna be a real challenge, because I think they're going to be competing in a space for student attention and time that I feel like is even more challenging than in person. I think it was already a challenge in person, right? Like when this student time was all over the place, when is the right time to engage students on campus? I think virtually is just equally, if not more complicated, because students in particular get bombarded. And you know this, working in communications, like what's the right channel, time, medium to send information to students. And I think now you're going to have this added influx of people that are trying to also kind of showcase themselves to students. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to see kind of how it shakes out. I think certain sectors are going to have a harder time because economically, and they might take longer to recover. But the recruiting piece for those that are really active college recruiters, I think they're going to, if they're financially doing well, I think they're going to find different routes to get to students and to share information. So I don't think necessarily it's going to impact it negatively. If there's a recession, it's going to impact everybody. But I think outside of that, it might not. And I think it's going to be the interesting sort of massive pivot for most universities, career centers, employers to try to navigate. Now, I will say for students, if students can't answer the question of, well, what did you do during the COVID summer of 2020? And if they say like nothing, I think that's going to be a problem, and that's going to start to separate students that maybe just identify something that they've done, volunteering somewhere, taking an online class, building a skill, picking up a hobby, even doing something that they can talk about. That's going to be the number one question on everybody's mind all fall long, right? Any alumni you network with, any employers you talk to, they're all going to ask you the question of like, so what did you do during the COVID summer? And so I think that's going to be the most critical thing for underclass students right now, is to find things and opportunities to really build and do something that they could then talk about in the future. And that shouldn't be the only reason they do it, but I think they're going to have to at least point to something that how they use their time.
True. Yeah, I think that's so true. So I want to put a last call out for questions. We do have only a few more minutes, but in relation to the summer, right, I would love if you could talk a little bit about how the Greene Center plans to support students throughout the summer.
Yeah, I think we have, I'm leading a work group right now, campus-wide, to work on developing a suite of resources for students to do things as an alternative to their summer plans that might have gotten canceled or disrupted. So success skills and skill building kinds of activities, building your leadership skills, building maybe specific kind of technical skills that you've been wanting to look at, like project management or web design, thinking about how to maybe do preparatory programs in anticipation of things you might do next year. So if you plan to apply for Fulbright, if you plan to apply to graduate school, what are some things you can do for the summer to start positioning yourself well for that? A second kind of bucket is what can we do with students that allows them to interact with each other to solve problems. So think design challenge, hackathon, case competition kind of idea. But we're looking to create an opportunity for students to come together and really kind of put their heads together to address a problem. And that's something that they can work on collectively, interdisciplinarily, and also then be able to kind of convey that. And then last but definitely not least, we're piloting a bunch of programs with third-party organizations to identify projects and internships that students can do virtually and remotely to allow them to build a skill set, but also gain some experience. So they might be shorter in term. They might be, maybe 20-hour project or a 2-week project or something like that. But it's, once again, helping them build experience. So we're kind of putting together all these pieces, and that's going to be ready in the next few weeks. And we'll be communicating that out to students via our social, our website, as well as some other student organization outlets.
Wow, that sounds great, Joe. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about that.
No problem.
Yeah, so I think we're out of time, but I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, for the great questions. And Joe, as always, thank you so much for letting us pick your brain and sharing some insights that you have.
Thanks, Danae. It's good to hang out with you again.
Of course. And for everyone listening, we hope to see you next Wednesday. It might be your final AMA for a while, but we hope you join us. And again, just bring your questions and we'll be here.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Danae.
Of course. Bye, guys.
Bye.